Welcome to Tripping on Legends. My name is Christopher Balzano. Trying my best to make it here every Tuesday night for our live show. We are broadcasting through all the streams that we possibly have that people actually care to follow me and follow the show on. So we are on midnight.fm, where it is always midnight. And I've been trying my best to keep my midnight.fm schedule, which is not always easy. Trying to do a show at least every other week if I can't. And those shows that I do are also broadcast on Facebook Live. And you can get that and anything pretty much that you are looking for in terms of Tripping on Legends at facebook.com/Tripping on Legends. And of course, IEGTV, who got to get a real sneak peek behind the curtain tonight as I was, good reference considering tonight's show topic, right? They were able to get a little bit as I actually even forgot my tea and had to run off and get it. So that is at IGTV, and you can follow me on Instagram at Spooky Tripping. Interesting show tonight. This is episode 96, and I'm calling it Blame It on the Witch. There was a little bit of back and forth between my co-host Elle and I, who's not with me tonight, about what I should name this episode. And I thought the origins of it were probably the best way to go. And if you will, the spirit of it is the best way to go, which is there's something wrong, there's something nasty in the state of Denmark, there's something that touches the paranormal, influences the paranormal, influences crime, influences true crime stories, and it's a theme. It's a theme that runs through so many haunted legends, so many ghost stories, all accounts of the weird. And as you probably already have in the back of your mind, it also has a heavy influence on true crime, right? On the state of not only paranormal investigation, but also criminal investigation. This idea that witches are to blame for everything. That if there is something wrong in your neighborhood, who are you going to call Ghostbusters, but who made it wrong in the first place? It would definitely have to be the witch. I feel like I should probably explain some of this kind of as we go into it. But I want to take a step back. It's interesting. Someone said to me, who I don't really know too well, but who saw the numbers of the episodes, not knowing that if you go to iTunes, if you go to Google Play, if you go wherever you get your podcasts, there are about 160 episodes now of Tripping on Legends that are out there. If you, in addition to kind of this, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and they were asking, what are you planning for your 100th episode? And it's honestly, I had never thought of it that way, because I don't think of Tripping on Legends as only having 96 episodes. I always call them 96 episodes proper. If you have an idea, right, I would love to get people's ideas of what they would like to have me do for a special slam bam 100th episode, 100th numbered episode. What kind of legend would you have me cover, right? What kind of idea do you want me to explore? Or especially if you are in Florida, what is a story that we haven't covered that you would love for us to tackle in the Tripping on Legends way? A few weeks ago when we did the elevator episode, I offered a contest, and I still have free copies of the book because no one answered. And I'm like, wait a minute, how you guys are crazy. How do you not know the answer to this? So I'm putting it out there communication-wise. I would love to know what people would like for me to do, or like for us to do, because Ella would definitely have to be involved in this. Our 100th episode. We're coming up on 5 years of doing the show, which equates to I don't know how many episodes a week, but not many. But I've been producing more the last year, and of course, going forward, hopefully we can get on the air. So contribute. Get in touch with me via email at spookytripping.com or at any of my social media platforms, the show's social media platforms, and tell us what you think would be a really great for 100th episode, 100 episodes of Tripping on Legends, and the show has gone through all these different permeations and all these different changes. And what it looks like now is very different than it looked like back in 2016 when it was Natalie and I sitting around talking about the Venice train depot. So contribute that, get back to us. I would love to even see a little bit of that going on in the chat room tonight. As I explore the idea of blaming it on witches, and I should take a step back and explain the rabbit hole. A few weeks ago, I think like 2 weeks ago now, I was doing an event in Hudson, Florida. So if you have no idea where Hudson, Florida is, you're probably pretty much in line with me. But it is next to Newport Richey. So most of the people who were at the event were either from Newport Richey or kind of, if people asked them, they would say I'm from Newport Richey because that was the primary focal point, right? Like I say I'm from Boston, but I'm from Cambridge and lived other places, but I say I'm from Boston. Same thing, Newport Richey. And as I was doing the presentation, which was a really interesting way of going about it, I was outside. We kind of had to do some things on the fly. It was a fun night. They had actually s'mores being made, and they were giving out s'mores kits. It was kind of an interesting little thing. And one of the women, and originally it was an older woman, said to me, how about those witches? What do you know about those witches? And I wasn't sure whether she was talking about, the plethora of girlfriends that I've had who have been into witchcraft, and she was trying to bring up my dating history somehow, or whether there was something else going on with this. But so I pressed her a little bit, and she, of course, anyone who comes and visits, or a lot of people who come and visit, naturally assume I know every single thing there is to know about every single haunted location in the world. And so there was this idea that, I knew about the witches and the paranormal happenings at Moon Lake in Newport Richey, of which I knew nothing. And I feel to some degree I still really don't know much about it. And she went on to say, they're evil. And I'm like, oh, okay, so what's going on? There's some scary stuff going on over there at Moon River. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, or Moon Lake, do you have any, thing to back that up? What are you talking about specifically? And it happened to be, there were two people who were in the audience who practice witchcraft, who practice Wicca, and they were kind of, I wouldn't say, and here was the spark of it for me, they were not offended by what she had just said. Instead, they were, that's what we deal with. And they went on to kind of almost come to blows right there. And and I kind of separated between them, and I had to play, the good host and be like, oh, wait a minute, there's some misunderstandings and things. And one side was very much a case of, this is not good. This is a bad thing in our community. It taints our community. People know that they exist, and they avoid that area, and that's not fair because Moon Lake is part of our community, and we feel like we can't go there because the witches have corrupted it with their evil satanic practices there. Of which the other people who were practicing witches, and I'm going to use the term witches tonight, where in place of all the different things, right? So I could use neo-paganism, I could use paganism, I could use Wicca. I actually know some people who consider themselves a witch who distance themselves from the word Wicca. They don't like the word Wicca. They feel maybe it's too confining. They feel as if it's not a true representation of what they do. I would also highly encourage anyone, especially when I get into some of these, the later parts of this episode, any of my witchy friends or enemies who want to call in at 813-418-6822 to kind of describe your perspective on this, what seems to be the eternal clash between society and what is considered societal norm, and what is good religion to practice, and safe religion to practice, and holy religion to practice, and the idea of witchcraft and how it seems to be the devastating force in many communities, and something that very much today is still ripping apart communities and being used as the explanation for things gone wrong. So these two women felt the need to defend themselves at some point, and they were trying to encourage a dialogue. A few weeks ago, I went to the karaoke. If you follow my personal social media, you know that we love to do the karaoke. And there were some people outside, and they were just running into people and trying to preach the word of God. And this guy, I think they were Jehovah's Witnesses, but I'm not 100% sure, but I think they were. And a Christian man of a different branch walked by. And when he walked by, he yelled out, which I thought was such an old school expression. He yelled out, "Well, you don't believe in any God that I believe in." To which I stopped the car, and I was there, and I was like, I felt like I was going to have to intervene because they were going to come to blows, because this guy was really angry when he said it. And he went, and where we were doing karaoke was closed, and he tried to open the door, and then the guy was like, "Hey, listen, man, can I just talk to you for a second about my religion?" And the guy was like, "Blah, blah, blah, blah," and he's like, "I understand what you're saying, I understand what you're saying, but let me just ask you a question." And then I was like, "All right, whatever's going to happen," and the guy, the man who was kind of angry, he almost immediately kind of dropped the facade, and he was like engaged in the conversation. I was like, "All right, these two are not going to kill each other over the same Jesus, so I'm going to take off." It was kind of like that. Like there was a very aggressive, older, kind of teeth gnarled, talking about this horrible Newport Richie coven. And then there was these two women who were, I don't even think they officially said they were part of that coven, who were trying to convert the angry people. And by the end of it, I kind of felt that, buy a damn book. Like, who cares about this shit? Buy a book. But then also, there was a little bit of common ground that the older women were definitely not converted, but they were, or even converted that witchcraft was something that was viable to practice. But it was more of, they were like, all right, well, we're gonna just leave you alone. Maybe you're not sacrificing naked children and drinking their blood by the full moon yet. And it got me to thinking that, wow, I know that we've covered this so many times, and it seems that we have hit upon the point that folklore is often the story of the outsider, right? And Tony has said Wicca is too new to be considered traditional witchcraft. And I would agree with that. And I think that the ever-changing face of witchcraft actually helps to breed some of the ideas of the outsider, and continue the narrative that a witch is responsible for the bad shit that's going on. And I think it actually helps to forward it, because neo-paganism and witchcraft are ideas that I remember reading this when I was studying Margaret Adler, right? And the name, I can't believe the name of her book. I've been saying it over and over again, Drawing Down the Moon. The idea that even the word neo-paganism or paganism, or which, so many people she interviewed or she introduced in that book hated those terms, and they didn't hate the terms because of the negative connotations, but because they hated to be tied down, right? They hated to be defined by a word and defined by what the ideas are that might go with that word. And so the way that they practiced their witchcraft was different than another person, and so to call them both neo-pagans would call them both Wicca, would be the equivalent of calling a Catholic a Baptist, right? Or to call well, I mean, come on, like, Jehovah's Witnesses and Russian Orthodox, that's the same thing, right? Like, the outsider would think that, but the person studying it would maybe not be offended, but be like, no, that doesn't define me. So because it's constantly changing, it constantly can evolve to the point where anything can be attached to it, right? So practices and rituals that might be associated with it, because there's no, and I've been using this word a lot the last week, because it hasn't been codified and identified and documented, and people are their own variant of it. Now, like I said, I have many friends who practice witchcraft, and I'm not sure any of them approach it and think of it exactly the same way. That leads to misunderstanding. And that's not a blame thing. I'm just saying, like, that leads to understanding. That leads to automatically being an outsider, because I can't clearly define and study you. Because every time I think that I understand what you are, you're not that, right? If I understand, my friend Jen, for example, is in here. If I understand Jen, that doesn't mean that I can understand, Marla Brooks, right? And if I understand Marla Brooks and I read her books, that doesn't mean I can understand my friend Amanda, right? Like, these people are all different in how they practice. You can go by coven names, but that doesn't really help us much. And so we started doing a little research on Newport Richie and witchcraft, right? To find out exactly, is there a connection, and why are people drawn to Moon Lake? And my first inkling of this, my first kind of like, okay, what's going on here, would be a lake, so it's water, and it's called Moon Lake. And I could probably have, if anyone wants to call in at 813-418-6822 to clarify and even expound upon what I'm talking about in this, they're welcome to do that. But many people, so if you have a natural connection to the earth, if you have a natural connection to nature, there is a very powerful force within the moon. I was not able to find, Moon Lake is in Pasco County, Florida, and it's on the southern side of Newport Richie. So I was actually probably closer to where I was in Hudson. It's an area that's well known, right? Newport Richie leads right into Holiday, Florida. It leads right into that A word. The other A word I'm not allowed to say, in respect of the late Laurie Champion. This idea that there's a stretch there in Pasco County that is rich with some kind of energy and some kind of force. Moon Lake is on the other side of that. So this idea that the moon would be connected to witchcraft is definitely not a new idea, right? And I think that if we had a full moon a little bit ago, and I was talking about saging my house, and 23 witches that I know were like, that's the night to do it, that's the night to do it, and they all had their idea of how to do it, but the idea that there was a connection between moons, between the full moon, between the cycles of the moon, and power, and being able to use that in your ceremonies, that's an idea that I think has at least in modern times is 100% truthful. I remember very clearly when I was making my love potion, right? When I was making my love potion for when we went to Arbuckle Creek, it was the same thing, right? The idea that you're leading into a full moon. The best thing for you to do is to leave this love potion out by the light of the full moon. It's gonna coincide with the legend trip anyway. It'll be more powerful that way. And so, Marla Brooks told me that was something that would give it extra zoom. So the idea that they would be drawn to Moon Lake, which I was not able to find why they call it Moon Lake, like where it got its name from. would make complete sense, right? We've got water, we've got the idea that it's somehow connected to the moon, and so there's a active coven, at least one active coven that is still very much connected to Moon Lake. Newport Richie's not that big. You know, it's one of those places where you know it, you've heard the name 100 times, 1,000 times. It's not huge, right? It's essentially a suburb of the suburb of Tampa. And I don't mean to offend anyone from Newport Richie if they think of their city as bigger than that or more important than that, and I'm not commenting on that. I'm just saying it's not one of the many metropoli of the Sunshine State. Yet, in that town, in downtown of that town, so not even like the outskirts of it, but like downtown Newport Richie, there are 4 metaphysical stores. Right? There are 4 places where a witch can go to supply up, connect, meet other people, and it's very much a place where people know that they can go. So other people I talk to who are in the areas, who are on the West Coast, from Tampa and then on upward, say that they all know about Newport Richie, and that they do go there to get their supplies. And I started wondering, like, okay, well, is this tension indicative of what the feel or the fervor is of Newport Richie? Like, we are now talking, it's 2021, and some of the things we're going to talk about are not that far away from 2001. Nothing I'm going to talk about is like 90 or 100 years old in terms of what's going on in that area. It's all fairly recent, and yet it pushes that narrative that the witch is the outsider and the outsider is to blame. If you are a fan of Tripping on Legends and you've been following us or catching up on old episodes or from the beginning or whatever, you'll know that we have come across this several different times in a very big way. I see that Della is in the house tonight. Obviously, our biggest witch case is this town is myth, right? It's the story of the Swamp Witch, and the Swamp Witch is one of those stories where the offending force is not a witch at all. It's not the outsider, it's the insider blaming the outsider. So under the idea that every person listening, every time you do something, there's one person who's never heard anything. The story of the Swamp Witch, which may or may not be connected to, and the inspiration for the Blair Witch Project, is very quickly a story of a woman who was part of the community. She kind of sold her wares. The community started to fail. So this is now like the community of Pemberton Ferry kind of we're talking about here. The locals blamed their belief and their reliance on this witch as to why things were going crappy. So the reason why everything is failing is because we're using this witch and God is attacking us. So they try her, kill her, they execute her. They put her, they hang her from a tree, and that's the end of the story. Until Hog Island starts to develop, the Hog Island campground, and now all of a sudden she's haunting the campground. So she scratches on the tents, and she can be heard cackling in the woods, and she's been known to dump things over, and a dark figure walks the swamp at the area that's there, and she's to blame for the bad things that are happening there. Some people have even extended that. I've been finding recently references to that's why Iron Bridge is so deadly, and she's there somehow, and because they're connected, and this idea that she's come back to get her revenge for being prosecuted, persecuted, and ultimately murdered for her crimes, which were helping people out in the first place. Heavy research, has kind of discovered that that's not the story at all, right? We were able to find an article that specifically talks about two black men who had killed a white woman who were brought out into the swamp and hung. And that was further kind of stressed or further, I don't know if you could say backed up, but we definitely got the impression of that when we were visiting the town. The Swamp Witch has been for almost 3 years now a fascination of mine. So, that was one of the stories. And in the same episode we initially talked about that, which was episode 48 when we first started talking about it, and I think it's episode like 52 or something where we have our things of it. We talked about the three witches, right? And one of the witches we talked about was the Witch of the Old Cemetery in Tallahassee, right? So this was the beautiful young woman who was so entrancing. Is entrancing a word? That she was able to seduce an older man to fall in love with her, which then caused, and then she died. And even in her death, she was so bewitching to him. Bell is her name, Elizabeth Bell, right? She was so. She had him under such a powerful spell that he built this huge monument to her in Tallahassee, in the Tallahassee Old Cemetery. This huge monument, and her grave faces the wrong way. And there's a quote from Poe on there. And if you haven't heard that episode and us breaking that down, it's a really interesting case of there's nothing wrong with there's no proof whatsoever that anything witchy has ever happened there, right? Instead, what it is just it seemed to be a guy who married a younger woman and was completely in love with her. The quote that is on there from Poe is a very if you don't understand literature, it's just merely saying she's gone now and I'm empty, essentially. Don't know why it's facing the other way, but it's this idea that because those elements are there, even though there was nothing in life to hint at witchcraft, she's known as a witch. And she's treated like that in all the literature whatsoever. So you cannot, because there is a ghost associated with it, the ghost is always told to be a witch, right? She is the witch of Tallahassee. And then, of course, the aforementioned love-potioned Arbuckle Creek. Very similar to the Swamp Witch story. This has got to be one of my favorite legend trips and my favorite legend trip stories of all time. The idea that on a bridge in Arbuckle Creek in Lorida, Florida, there was a deal being struck for a love potion. And the guy who was told that the price was going to be his firstborn child flips out, kills the witch, throws her over the side, she impales on a cypress. He weighs the body down, and the one person in history to commit a crime in Florida and flee. Usually it's people commit crimes other places and they flee to Florida. He gets out of there, and her body floats to the top, and she's still seen on the bridge. And potentially the soul of the man and his actual firstborn child are also trapped at the bridge. And she has been disturbing drivers there, and she's blamed for the town going wrong. So when the town started to fail, they dug up her body, they brought it to another county, and they burned her remains. And we're like, now the town's going to be back on track. Didn't work, so they went and were actually able to find a newspaper article that talks about the burning of the house. They went to her shack, they burned it down, right? And still, Lorida fell into obscurity and is now a ghost town. We can even say that in some variations, Mini Lights come out tonight, there's a witch in that story, right? There's so many variations of it. And what you find is this. If there's a haunted location and the story is the story of the outsider, you almost always can find that becoming a witch. We place the idea, and we all have it in our minds when we think of a witch, right? I remember I think I was at that same event, and I was talking about the witch, the swamp witch, and I had Del Daughtry's picture of a witch, which is an absolutely beautiful witch, right? And it's red hair, I believe. And I'm holding it up, and they're like, "That's not a witch. Like, witches are ugly." Like, even in that small context, that had to be she was old. It had to be she was ugly. It had to be she was cackly, and we have put forth that image for 105. Well, I would say now what we're talking like 700 years since the first European witch trials and witch killings were put forth. We could argue that that image of a witch appears in the Bible in terms of like the Witch of Endor. She's described that way, and of course Shakespeare, which is several hundred years old, once again pushes it forward. And it's this idea that to make someone an outsider, they can't be beautiful. They can't have an ideal, any kind of ideal attached to them, because then they're somewhat seductive. And somewhere along the line, witchcraft got mixed in with the worship of Satan. And so it became even worse. It's almost as if we can handle them druids, right? Even though we need to convert them as well. But the idea of a pact with the devil, that the essence of witchcraft is a pact with the devil, is really what drives the European witch hunts and then the ones here in America. And I would extend that to modern times, right? The idea that they worship Satan bad, they're coming for your kids, is so strong. It's almost as way, we've talked before about the satanic panic, and I've been hitting that again, especially with doing some old research, and of course those that are in Freetown. And we it's almost like a two-pronged attack, right? We have Satanists, and then we have witches, and witches could be Satanists. So someone's coming for your kids, and it's either a Satanist or it's a witch. And I would say that none of the witches that I know, now I know Satanists, right? I know people who practice some variant of Satanism, and that is, once again, much like witchcraft, different branches of a tree, right? They do not practice. There's the Church of Satan, which is kind of what people think all Satanism is. But then, of course, every person I've talked to is not a fan of the Church of Satan, but has their own variation of it. There are things that cross over, like the idea of this kept coming up as quotes from the witches who were in the articles that I was reading about, kept saying do as you please as long as it causes no harm to someone else, which once again is one of the tenets of the Church of Satan, right? The idea of do whatever you want to do what makes you feel good, which is where it kind of varies a little bit, as long as you're not hurting other people. Then people would argue that that's not a tenet of Satanism and that that's not a core belief, but for the Church of Satan, that's what's put forward. This craziness in Newport Richey has a history. It seems to have kind of started in the 1990s, right? So in the 1990s, there were several witches who moved in near Moon Lake. And there was an active coven there. I'm going to see how many geeks we have in the audience that were known as the Lothorians, right? So the name of this coven was the Lothorians, or the Lothorian Circle. They now seem to be defunct. Like I was able to track, wanting to get in touch with them, wanting to see their reaction, years and years later. What did they think about this? Because this originally happens in 1990, right? And I wasn't able to, but I was able to find records that they are no longer a non-profit. So I'm not sure the coven, but back then it was the circle of Lothorian, or the Lothorians. And can anyone know Lothorian? You got me? Am I even pronouncing it right? Hopefully, I'm pronouncing it right. It's from Lord of the Rings. It's where the elves are kind of hanging out. Riverdale and Riverdale. I don't think I've got that name right at all. But and then Lothlorien. They move in, and almost immediately, and this is a back and forth that goes on for a year, right? They start to open shops. They have a life there, and they're practicing on what it seems to be kind of disputed. Is it public property? It would seem to be public property. As I was tracking like the who owns Moon Lake, it seems that it's now, or at least back then, was private property. And both of these people, and then they said there was a Baptist on one end of the street, a Jehovah's Witness on the other end of the street, and then behind them were these witches, right? And they considered themselves Wicca. They used the word Wicca for themselves. Thank you, Rivendell. We had a Rivendell coven here in Fort Myers for years. I would be very interested to talk to you about that and the idea of the connection between elves in Tolkien world and the connection to witchcraft. So that seems like it would be another completely different show that I would love to hit upon, because that's an interesting connection there. All of a sudden there start to be stories, and I was able to find story after story, newspaper stories, mind you, of kids going back into the woods and reporting seeing naked people, or reporting seeing altars covered in blood. And much like the Satanic Panic, much like the clown craze of the 80s, these reports were given a lot of weight, because as they were happening, this battle was raging between these families there, and so one of the men said that he heard pigs squealing, so he knew they were sacrificing animals. Another said he went back there and he saw them having sex and having all these wild, crazy orgies. None of which was ever able to be proven, right? It keeps going back and forth. So it's crazy because these witches were so... their houses had been shot at, they had been vandalized, and so they actually decided to do a ritual where they went to Moon Lake and they shot a gun into the ground as they were calling the four winds, right? So as they were calling the north, south, east, and west, they were actually shooting a gun into the ground. That was a ritual that I had never heard of before, or an angle on it that I never heard. To which they were shot at, right? Someone started shooting a shotgun into the woods at them, right? And I think it was Della earlier had said something to the effect of, this is why people don't share their ideas and don't share their beliefs, because this completely erupted the town. And these two sides were battling back and forth for what was going to be, who was going to own the town, right? And was there going to be religious freedom? This is Florida, right? I mean, we're not talking Bible Belt, right? Because Florida shoots past the Bible Belt. But we're talking still an area where conservative Christian ideas have a stronghold in the political system, in the school systems. There's still a strong sense of community built around traditional conservative views, regardless of how many people come here or live here now that are not from the state. Newport Richey is not necessarily one of those towns. It's not like Lee County, where so many people are transient. There are people who have been in Newport Richey for generations. This kind of tore the community in two. And you can see, we're talking 1990, and they're still arguing, right? Those people were still arguing as they're sitting watching some weird guy talking about ghosts. And the idea that they automatically connected the witchcraft to ghosts is also interesting, right? I came across this quote, and I want to read this quote in its entirety. But I want you, by the way, the articles that I found, the incident happened happened July 17th or June 17th, or July 17th. These articles are all from Halloween. So they actually the newspapers revived the case for Halloween. Once again, because witches are Halloweeny. Here's the quote. This is from Dennis E. Owens, who is an assistant professor of religion at the University of Florida. This is him writing in 1990. Pig squealing seems to be doubtful. There are a lot of these people who practice this. It really has become a feminist alternative to the rather patriarchal religions that have dominated American culture. I'm going to read that again. It has really become a feminist alternative to the rather patriarchal religions that have dominated American culture. This is someone who is, to some degree, defending or looking to explain witchcraft to the masses. And the way that he defines it is an alternative, a feminist alternative to the rather patriarchal religions that have dominated American culture. I would love to hear feedback from some of my witch friends on that comment, because I've got several issues with it. I still think it paints the witch as the outsider, right? So we have someone who does not conform to society. So rather, it's almost like we can be a melting pot, but witches are over there, right? Witches are not allowed in that. But then this idea that witchcraft can't be a thing in and of itself. Witchcraft cannot be something that is of virtue and intrinsically powerful. Instead, it is most effective as a reaction to it. So in other words, you're not a witch because that's your idea. That's your system of ideas, but because you're rebelling against something, right? And I understand that there is a certain level of sexism to it. Now, I would say my ratio is probably 65, 35 females and males that I know that I would consider themselves practicing witchcraft. So it is heavily leaned towards. But and obviously, when you are discussing the folklore of this, women empowerment and women being important to the functioning of society breeds into the idea of the witch being the outsider, right? Because in many places, she was the person you went to for help, which gave her power, right? But then when things went wrong, you turned against her. Like, so there definitely is that idea. Jen says, still an outsider, and slapping feminism on it to further alienate those who practice it is just lovely. And knowing Jen, I appreciate her sarcasm. I think it minimizes what witchcraft is to talk about it as only or primarily a reaction. Because once again, you are defining, just like talking about Satan as the center of witchcraft, the old idea of Satan as the center of witchcraft, you are defining it by a Christian ideal, by saying that it's only a reaction to it. So whereas I think Professor Owens is trying to give you a legitimate picture, I think it's a very academic idea to think of, like, well, it's a reaction to the feminism of the... You see a rise in occult activity that coincides with the sexual revolution as brought on by the empowerment of women. When we allow them to vote, they will then take our children to commit rituals of paganism and spread loving trees instead of, doing what they're supposed to do and making dinner. Like, that's maybe all part of it. And I would honestly say that many of the witches I know do talk about how much they hate the patriarchal system of other religions. But that's not why they practice what they practice, right? That's not the way it goes. They believe in a system. So you have these two arms, right? One is, and you can use, there are buzzwords. So I'm hitting buzzwords hard in this next section. You have one arm that is feminist, right? So witches are just women who can't deal with men being in charge of certain religions, and so they break off to form this weird one themselves, right? So you have this kind, and keep in mind, feminists, and I don't think Professor Owen means this, but it is. Feminist is a buzzword for coming for your children, right? Feminist is. I don't want to get political. I don't like to get political, but you see, there's an element of this to that. It's a buzzword for left, right? It's a buzzword for liberal. It's a buzzword for wants to teach your kids that homosexuality is okay and all these kind. It's got that arm to it, right? Then there is still the spooky, creepy, coming to kill you aspect of witches, right? And that's the driving force, I think, behind a lot of the fear. You need to strike out against witches before they strike out against you. And there's a history of this too, right? There's a history of this idea that here's a word. So I started researching, and you guys in the chat room are amazing tonight with your ideas on here. I wish I could address them all as I go. But there's some really great ideas. So you should be joining. If you're not joining the chat room, you're not doing this live, it is at facebook.com/trippingonlegends is where I broadcast it through there as I'm on midnight.fm. But there's a lot of really good ideas going on in the chat room right now. But I came across the Blue Moon Murders. So in doing this, it all of a sudden crossed over because, oddly enough, there's still folklore attached to this, even though this is a case that is only, well, the conviction came down a little over a year ago. So this is still very fresh, and it hits the idea of folklore and the idea of witchcraft being the smack from both sides. So I want to start it by exploring a word with you. This is the English teacher in me. School's back in session. I want you to deal with it. What does the word ritualized mean? Right? The idea of ritualized. It's something that comes up often when you're looking at crimes that are supposed to take on an occult feel to them, right? Ritualized. I'm not one of those people that's like, Webster's defines ritualized as the... We all can think in our head, we hear it on newspaper reports, ritualized, the murder was ritualized. I take you back to 1969, right? Charles Manson, whether you believe in the idea of Helter Skelter, whether that was an idea that was only part of the prosecution, and he's quoted by several members of the family as on the night of committing the murder to write a message, and his words were, "Write something witchy." You guys remember that? That's the very specific, write something witchy. We see this word used time and time again. We have had, like I said, there's been a lot of work done to defuse, to understand the ramifications and the spark of the satanic panic, right? But there is not an equal movement to understand the witch panic, right? The belief that there are still witches who are committing ritualistic murders and occult murders for the sake of appeasing either Satan, as misunderstood by some law enforcement, or at least, in the very least, whatever entity or whatever creator they think that is out there. Which brings us to Pensacola, Florida, and Escambia County. And I know I have at least one person who is planning on coming tonight who is living in that area. And the night of July 28th, Pensacola, Florida, 2015. Von Seal Smith, age 77, is murdered. Also murdered are her son, Richard Smith, 49, and John Smith, 47. Okay? So it's really important to understand the dates here. All three are murdered. They're brutally murdered. So let's start with that idea, brutally murdered. And I'm not a true crime podcaster. I would love to see Paradise After Dark do a complete episode where they get into this case in much more detail than I'm going to get into in like the next 10 minutes. But it's really fascinating, everything that's going on. Yes, ritualized is in common usage, and that is when we start to words don't have impact because we don't think about them when they're used all the time, when they become a cliche. And the word ritualized is like that because these were considered ritualized murders. And here's why they were considered ritualized murders. They were killed with a hammer, right? The hammer was actually on site. They were killed with a hammer. Their throats were then cut, right? They were found in separate rooms under clothing, right? And so the house, once again, this is the Blue Moon murder. If you look at some of the pictures of the house, you would think that there was some crazy shit going on. But spoilers, it's not. It was they were hoarders essentially, and they lived this kind of reclusive comes up all the time in this case, that word. They lived an isolated lifestyle, and they were confined to this house. The two brothers went out and worked and then come right back home, and they lived and instantly, I shouldn't say instantly, the brothers don't report to work, and so they do like a well call. And on the well call, which happens on July 31st, the bodies are discovered. They're in separate rooms. They're underneath a whole bunch of clothes and junk. The oldest brother, Richard Smith, the younger brother, I should say, Richard Smith, older brother, Richard Smith, is found shot in the head. So he's shot in the head and hit with the clawed hammer and had his throat cut. So it's major overkill. So we have all of this, and overkill has been a word that's used for ritualistic murders, right? The police come out a week later. The police come out a week later, and they say the crime scene was very complex. So this guy, Sheriff David Morgan, immediately comes out and says, it's witchcraft. I'll say that right now. And his idea for this, the method of death, the position of the bodies, and then our person of interest has some ties to that as a religion, that is indicative of that. So when kind of called to the mat of why he would consider this, he essentially was saying it was a ritualistic murder, and the person who we think might have done it, the person of interest, is a Wiccan. So it all makes sense because, as we all know, if you are a Wiccan, you are definitely about to commit a murder. Oddly enough, he then goes on to say, and this is not a direct quote, in that county, in Escambia County, you have to factor in the potential for a ritual killing no matter what. And I thought that was a really interesting thing, and I did a little more research, and there is some crazy cases that come out of Pensacola and that part of the Panhandle, including a case where a guy had he trained this group of ninja kids to go, and they were there is some crazy stuff. I had to stop and do it a little bit, but I came, I was like, okay, well, where does this place us, right? So we're in 2015. where this is going on. That's post the West Memphis Three, right? The West Memphis Three is in 1993. You look at that case. So think about that case. If you know it at all, the Paradise Lost case. There's no, and the murders were considered ritualistic, which is why they thought, yeah, it is Florida, which is why they thought these guys would be good for it, right? It's 20 years after the Rod Ferrell case. If you don't know the Rod Ferrell case, look it up. I was actually wondering whether or not I should put this in my book, at least mention it, because it does happen near the Ocala National Forest. But it's essentially a cult of kids, teens, who thought the head of this Rod Ferrell was a vampire, who then went and killed the parents of one of the members. Came back to Florida, I should say, killed her so that they could run off together, right? Because it's too complex for me to hit, but that's the basic of it. Once again, in that case, you do have these people were practicing some form of vampirism, but the murder was considered ritualized, even though all he did, I believe, was beat him with a crowbar. There might not be a crowbar, but there. Society, right? If you shoot someone, if you stab someone, there is a level of normality to that. Horrible, tragic, but it's all normal. I'm thinking of the Joker, in terms of it's part of the plan. We have used the word ritualized, and we've created it as a way to describe the insanity of man. The idea that you don't need to be involved in the occult to frenzy. It's psychological, right? It's need based. It's need driven, I should say. The idea, if we looked back in Cold Blood, right? That case, or even the idea of the DeFeos, that automatically we have to apply some kind of voodoo dust over anything where the murder is slightly off kilter from what's to be expected. This gentleman, David Morgan, saw a crime scene, and I've seen the pictures of they don't have the pictures of the bodies, but they've got the pictures of the rest of the house. It's a mess. I mean, it's but it's a mess because that's where they were. That was the nature of their lifestyle. Thought someone was good for it. Came up with a suspect, and then worked his way backwards. Right? They had a he was a Wicca. He was a Wiccan. And so therefore these had to be murders that were to sacrifice. And I've seen the interrogation. It very specifically says, so in Wicca, you have to, I'm obviously not using a panhandle accent on this. So you have to sacrifice humans, right? So that would be something important to you, to sacrifice a human? It's like, what? Even the guy is like, what are you talking about? It was a blue moon. the police came flat out and said, because this was committed on the blue moon, we know the blue moon has to do with power in the Wiccan religion, and therefore we know that the murder had to have been a practicing witch who was sacrificing on their most holy of day, the blue moon. So if you know what a blue moon is a month that has 2 moons in it, right? 2 full moons, I should say. Yes, we talked about the beginning of the episode. There is definitely a connection between moon and power and ideas. Of course, good old Professor Owens would say it has something to do with menstrual cycles as well. Literally, the police came out and said a Wicca had to have committed this murder, and flat out, it's witchcraft. I'll say that right now. That's a quote from a sheriff. Dude didn't even freaking get it right? The bodies were found on a full moon, right? So July 31st, 2015 was a blue moon, but not on the 28th when the actual murders happened. So the murders didn't even happen on a full moon, on a blue moon. This was the driving force, and this became once again a call to everyone in the area to be careful, that there were cults in the area, that there were witchcraft circles in the area, of which there were, right? It's really interesting that they called upon, there have been, dozens of covens that have been identified or that have, talked openly, and yet every person that the news was calling on was a national one from New York and all that stuff like that, right? Guess what? Guess who the evil satanic Wiccan man was who killed it? Like, it was her other son, right? It was the oldest of the kids, a guy by the name of Donald Hartling. So he essentially, right, his name is Hartling. They were Smith. He's Hartling. He was the outsider for a completely different reason than his witchcraft. He was from another father. He lived close by. So he lived close by. By the way, one of the brothers was part of the Department of Homeland Security. So you have this horrible murder. They don't think it could be because of the brother down the street. They don't think it could be because of the some kind of connection to Homeland Security. They automatically assume it's because Donald practiced witchcraft, which he did, right? That can't be denied. But he killed them for the money. So he was essentially, as the kind of outsider of the family. He, like I said, he had a different father. He seems to be successful because he moved out of the house. The other 2 brothers were still living in the house in their 40s. He killed them for the money. He was being left out of the will. I've tried to analyze the defense of this, like how he was defended. He seemed to have pled not guilty, and then they were kind of like going from that, right? Because there's a trial, and yet in the sentencing phase, they brought in all this stuff that said he did do it, but he had a reason. There were mitigating factors. He had a reason for doing it, but it would seem that in addition to the money, this dude suffered, according to him, a horrendous life at the hands of this family. That as a child, he was abandoned by his dad, taken on by his mom. He had been sexually abused by a member of the family. He had lived in isolation with that family kind of throughout the years. He had depression. He had a detachment disorder, which is where if you don't get love like early on in life, you have this kind of, you are unable to make emotional connections. He gets out. He has his own family, or at least he has a son. That son is then, according to court documents or court testimony by the son, he is not molested by his uncle John Smith, 47, who dies in the murders, but John exposes himself. And when Richard Donald comes and he's like, he did this, the mom, who seems to be kind of like the head of the loon here, she denies it. She won't support him. She's saying he's lying, the son's lying. So he further distances himself from the family, which is then causes her to cut him off. There's a... He also, this is not the funny part, he also suffered from frontotemporal dementia. Now, they didn't say whether that was due to some kind of trauma or whether that was due to development, but they showed a lot of x-rays and a lot of MRIs of his frontal lobe, and it impairs your cognitive function. So they kind of threw all the pasta at the wall to see if they could get this guy. He was convicted in 2020, like January, I think like January 29th or something, like the very end of January in 2021, or 2020 rather. And great state of Florida decided to let him serve 3 life sentences. So he was not given the death penalty, which obviously upset some people, but there you go. In the trial, his former cellmate testified to him having planned this for 3 years. But the same guy also testified that Donald said that he finally knew it was time to commit the murders because he consulted a Ouija board, and the Ouija board told him now was the time. So even in this clear-cut case of it wasn't a blood ritual, it wasn't for a higher purpose, he essentially killed his brother John, by hitting him with a hammer and slicing his throat. Most of which was done to scare the crap out of his mom. He then turns on his mom and tortures her. Why does that not seem like I'm using the right word? Tortures her for long enough for her to give the number of the safe, like the combination to the safe, including cutting off at least one of her fingers, which was once again quoted as being further evidence of it being witches that did this. He then hits her and slices her throat. His brother comes home from his job and kind of surprises them. He shoots him in the head, but he's a bad shot, and the brother's still alive, and so he once again slices his throat and then buries them all under blankets and clothes and trash. There's a logic to that progression of events, right? However screwed up it is, and the mind of someone who's not right. But it's ritualistic, right? It's ritualistic. Anything that's not straightforward murder has got to be ritualistic, which means the occult is involved. And we once again, through all these cases, right? Through all these, like I said, the Rod Farrell case, the West Memphis 3, it comes up anytime, and then I was able to find multiple other versions, which we won't get into tonight because they're not nearly as connected, of whenever there's something that is strays from the norm in terms of its appearance, all of a sudden it's got to be occult. And I'm using occult, not occult, but occult, OCC, you know me, which continues to further the folklore, right? Which is how it fits in with what we're doing. The idea that a witch is still around reinforces the idea that the witch who we use in folklore is justified, right? That justifies her, usually her. By the way, notice all of those people I just mentioned were men, and not women. It's almost like proving your point by the present day, and it makes everything of those stories. I can believe the Swamp Witch because murders are still happening today in the name of witchcraft. And that's the shame, right? That's the as a folklorist you can track that and you can look at it, but as a human you say, wow, how the hell do you break that cycle? I can't solve that problem tonight, sir. I'm just trying to date your daughter. But how do you break that cycle of when things are still going on and our prejudices formed by the folklore reinforce the folklore? That's the beauty of the world we live in. That's what being a human is, right? So we are reaching the end of our time together. I want to thank you guys. I know we've got the case, or there were a few different things that got cut off because of time. I want to do like a recap episode talking about the elevator hauntings we didn't get to, and then of course Highgate Cemetery. Let me know. Let me know if you want me to do an episode that is not like on a normal live. It's just me kind of sitting down chatting, talking about those cases with people. I think it would be an interesting little thing. But we are, like I said, we are approaching 100. Give me your ideas for that. Make sure that you are, if you are subscribing to this, if you're listening to this on iTunes or Google Play, that you review the podcast. Our reviews have gone up a little bit in terms of the number, so we like to see that. And I always love to see, someone criticizing me. Those are always good. I can't say the word "and" without double checking myself to make sure I'm saying it right. But please review the podcast, good or bad. Please make sure that you are following us on Facebook at facebook.com/trippingonlegends. Please make sure you are listening to Midnight.fm and getting the quality content that they're giving you every single night, and following us on Instagram at Spooky Tripping. Tons of ways to follow us. Obviously, season is coming up. I've got a whole bunch of events coming, so if you're local in Florida, I'll be making my way into different parts of the state. I would love to see some of you guys out there to kind of challenge me on some of these. I would love to hand you the mic and see how well you know the Tripping on Legends stuff. So make sure that you are following us. Make sure that you are keeping in touch with what's going on and keeping me on my toes. Make sure you are giving me your legends, right? You guys are the ones that fuel this, because people are what fuel folklore to begin with. So I am Christopher Balzano, and here's hoping that all of your trips